The second distinctive is a consistent literal interpretation to the Bible. And here's the way it reads. We adopt a consistent literal, historical, grammatical, contextual hermeneutic in every portion of Scripture. Now, the whole issue with the literal, grammatical, historical method, you might wonder why that's an issue. It has to do with authority. Who is going to have the authority in the teaching process? Is it going to be the interpreter, or is it going to be the biblical text? It's the same battle you see going on in the legal system. There are those of us that believe the Constitution should be interpreted by our judges according to the framers' intent. Other people say, no, the framers' intent gets in the way of my woke ideology, and so I want a Constitution that's sort of, malleable. And the whole issue there is who's going to have authority? Is it going to be the mind of a judge, or is it going to be the text? And so we believe that the literal, grammatical, historical, contextual method of interpretation puts the authority back where it belongs, in the text of Scripture rather than in the mind of the preacher. And of course, people say, well, what about figures of speech? We take into account figures of speech. We see the difference between denotative and connotative language. Charles Ryrie said of literal interpretation, it might also be called plain interpretation, so that no one receives the mistaken notion that the literal principle rules out figures of speech. So figures of speech are common in any language. My wife said to me last night, or when I woke up this morning, how did you sleep last night? And I said, I slept great. I slept until 7 a.m., and I slept like a log. When I say 7 a.m., I'm using denotative speech. When I say like a log, she doesn't say, well, you mean you turned into a piece of wood last night? I know our name is Wood, so you must have turned into a piece of wood last night. No, the like, indicates we're dealing with a simile. So, people like to straw man this literal interpretation thing and make it sound like we don't acknowledge figures of speech, which is just a silly argument. E.W. Bullinger. And you're doing pretty well when you write a book 100 years ago that's still the standard. His classic book, Figures of Speech Used in the Bible, will give you every single figure of speech you could ever think of, and then a bunch of figures of speech you've never thought of in that book. But you see, the key word here in literal interpretation is consistent. Did you see that? We adopt a consistent literal interpretation. It says at the bottom there, in every portion of Scripture, which means we apply this in Romans, in the Gospels. We apply it to Genesis 1 through 11. We apply it to Daniel. We apply it to Ezekiel. We apply it to the book of Revelation. And that's what's not being done. People are literal somewhere, but they're not literal everywhere. In 1994, John Walvoord was asked, what do you predict will be the most significant theological issues over the next 10 years? He responded, the hermeneutical problem of not interpreting the Bible literally, especially the prophetic areas. The church today is engulfed in the idea that one cannot interpret prophecy literally. And so this is the climate that we're living in. The Evangelical Church of America recently dropped premillennialism from their doctrinal statement on the grounds that premillennialism is a non-essential doctrine. So let's open our Bibles, could we, to the non-essential section. I mean, if God said it, it's important, right? Including eschatology. And it's tragic because prophecy is a lamp shining in a dark place. 2 Peter 1 verse 19, that we would do well to pay attention to. That's why over according to the Bible, was prophetic or eschatological at the time it was written. Now, we do this not just in eschatology, we do it in protology, the doctrine of the beginning. Because we use this method, we have an idea of the beginning that says we're really dealing with the age of man and the age of the earth in the thousands of years, not the millions of years or the billions of years, because the literal method will not yield an old earth mindset. So this literal method pushes us in the direction of young earth creationism, and it pushes us in the direction of premillennial, pre-tribulational eschatology. Why? Because that's what the literal method calls for. Amen. Now that's under assault. William Lane Craig, in a recent podcast, said, I've seen a comparable statistic that says 50% of our evangelical pastors think the world is less than 10,000 years old. Now, when you think about that, and keep in mind, William Lane Craig is supposedly one of our great apologists. When you think about that, that is hugely embarrassing, that half of our ministers really believe that the universe is only around 10,000 years old. That's just scientific nonsense. And yet this is the view that the majority of our pastors hold. It's really quite shocking when you think about it. So he thinks it's shocking that half of the pastors hold to young earth, whereas I think it's shocking that half of them don't hold to young earth. But there's this funny thing that's happening in a lot of our circles where people will take some kind of aggressive stand on Genesis 1 through 11, and then when it comes to the subject of eschatology, I love Answers in Genesis. We took our whole youth group to see the Ark, but that ministry is jam-packed with the mindset that you can take Genesis 1 through 11 literally, but when it comes to eschatology, they just sort of kiss that off. That's a departure, because Henry Morris, the founder of the Young Earth movement, was aggressive. In fact, he wrote two great commentaries, the Genesis record and the Revelation record. He said, let's take it all literally. So the Apostle Peter in 2 Peter 3, verses 5 through 7, connects the end and the beginning. You know, what you believe about the beginning is going to influence your view of the end. What you believe about the end is going to influence your view about the beginning. Peter doesn't say be literal here, but not there. The two doctrines, protology and eschatology, are inextricably linked. And this is what we hold to at Chafer Seminary. This is a non-negotiable.